Good afternoon, class. I hope that all of you had a great Thanksgiving break. And now we're going to dive right back into a really cool topic in our science book called Classification of Living Things. So before we get into how we classify living things, we actually have to break down and define what it is to classify something. What we're going to do in this unit is very special. We're going to try something a little bit different. And what we're going to do, and each of you have one of these on your desk, it's a notebook. And what this is going to serve as for the next week is our classification notebook. What that means is that everything that we go over in class, whether it's a cool topic that we discuss, or group work that we do together, or anything that is of any importance, we need to write it down here in our classification notebook. Okay? Now, let's review real quick before we get into our classification lesson what you need to do to be a good note taker. A good note taker always makes sure that their notes are easy to read and they're legible. Now, how do you know what notes you're taking when you go back and look at it? Well, it's simple. Most of the time what people do, and this is what I'd like to see all of you do for the next week, is to actually write down the topic that we're talking about. So, for example, today would be classification, so go ahead and write that down on your classification notebooks on your first page. And another good thing also to write at the top is the date. So today is December 2nd, 2013. So that way when you go back and you look at your notes and review what you learned today in class, you'll know the topic and you also know when you did it. One thing I would like you guys to do for the next week is anything that we discuss on our whiteboard or any videos that you watch or anything we do as a group, I would like you to write down as much information as possible. Now these are your notes, which means it's what is most important to you to remember. But also, if Mr. Sutphin says, make sure you write down the definition of classification, then I need you to write it down. Okay? Does everybody understand? Is there any questions about note-taking? Okay, great. Now we're gonna move on. So, could you please open up your science textbooks to page 68, and we're going to start lesson 1, which is titled How Living Things Are Grouped. Okay, now before we get started with the reading, I would like to ask all of you right now, give me your best definition of what classification means to you. Yes? Okay, that's good. That's a good start. Good, good. One more. Okay, great. So it looks like we have a good idea of what classification means. But let's talk about what can be classified. What type of things can be classified? Sure, go ahead. Yeah, that's true. That can be classified. Great, that can also be classified. The great thing about classification, guys, is that everything can be classified. And you probably do a lot more classification every day of your lives than you think. Like, for example, last night I was helping Mrs. Sutphin put the dishes away. And one thing that she always tells me is to make sure that I put all the silverware in the right container slots. If you ever open up your drawer at home, sometimes you open up the utensil drawer and you got your forks, your knives, and your spoons. Well, you're classifying those by putting each of those into their own slots. That's what classification is. You take the same thing, which is a utensil, and you put it in a slot based on what you use it for. So, like a spoon, you would use it for eating cereal or stirring something. A knife, you would use it to cut something, and a fork you would use to, stab your food and eat it. Well, that's how silverware is classified, for an example. What other things could be classified? Great, guys. That is great examples of classification. Now what we're going to do is we're going to watch a YouTube clip about classification of musical instruments. So we're going to look up here on the whiteboard and we're going to watch it, and we're going to see how these different musical instruments were classified. Okay, now that we watched the video, let's talk about a few things. How were some of the musical instruments classified? Maybe by their make, maybe by their sound, or maybe whether or not they have strings. Again, that is another example of classification of musical instruments, and that's how an orchestra works. An orchestra sets each instrument into groups. They classify them by what they play, and then they make music together in harmony, and that's what's called an orchestra, like it was explained earlier on the video. Okay, now who would like to read our first paragraph on page 68 about classification? Great, go right ahead. Okay, I'll stop you right there. So we just highlighted the book's definition of classification, which is the process of where grouping similar things together makes sense in a kitchen. They used the kitchen example. So overall, what it means to classify something is to putting things in groups based on their similarities, and then you break those down from there. So let us ask a few questions once again. Do we all understand what the meaning of classification is? Great. Okay. Now, here's a question. Since we're in our science textbooks and we're talking about science and classifying living things, how is that useful to scientists? Yeah, that's correct. Good, so scientists use classification to classify living things. They take animals, plants. How would they classify those? Maybe by fur, or how many legs they have, if they have a tail, and maybe for plants, what color they are, how many leaves they have, whether it's a flower or a tree. So that's how scientists use classification. So now what we're going to do is I brought in a bunch of items today. And what we're going to do is we're going to break into groups of 5 when we're ready, and we're going to classify different items and break those down into different classification groups, such as shoes, coins, buttons, and a few other things that I've also brought in today. So what we're going to do is we're going to use our classification notebooks, and we're actually going to write down how we classify these things. And once we do that, then we will come back as a whole group and we will discuss what our findings are. So you may be asking yourself, well, how would I do that? And that's okay if you don't know. So let's just talk about an example. Let's say in my one hand I have a tennis shoe with laces, and in this hand I have a slipper. Well, what is one difference that you can tell me right here between these? They're both shoes. But what is it that you can tell me about them? Yes, this one has laces, this one doesn't have laces. Anything else you can see that's a difference? Yes, this shoe is black and the slipper is brown. See guys, that's all there is to it. That's how you classify things. So we're gonna see if you guys can go ahead and break into groups, and I'll be walking around to observe, and if you have any questions, please raise your hand, and we'll do this for about half an hour. We'll rotate every 5 minutes based on when you hear the transition music that we talked about yesterday, how we're going to transition from activity to activity. And then after our half hour's up, we'll go right ahead, we'll get back into a whole group, and we'll talk about what we did and see how we classify some things, okay? Okay, great. Now that we're back in our whole group, who would like to go first and tell me about what they classified and how they did it? Okay, great. So you did the coins. All right. So what kind of coins were in there? Okay, there was quarter, there was dimes, there was nickels, and there was pennies. Well, those are 4 different types of coins right there, but what are pennies made out of? Yeah, that's right, copper, and the rest of them are made out of silver, right? Okay, great, so you separated those and classified those based on what they're made of, right? Well, great, now, if you look at, did you look at anything else with that? Size, yes. The quarter is bigger than a nickel and a dime, so you could separate those even further. Great, that's awesome, you guys did a great job. Did anybody else have anything different as far as coins go? That's a good one. Separated them by year. Coins are made every year, and they always have a made-by date on the front or the back of them. So this group actually went ahead and separated them by year. And that is also an excellent way to classify something like that. Okay, anybody else? Would anybody else like to share? Nobody else would like to share? Oh, we need to hear more than that, guys. Let's talk about it. Okay, great, you did the buttons. How'd you do that? So some were round and some were square. Okay, great. So you separated them by them being round or square. What else? Anybody else want to share about the buttons? Now guys, if you don't remember what you did, make sure you refer back to your notebooks. That's what it's there for, so you can remember things. Remember how Mr. Sutphin talked to you guys about how I take notes at work when my boss tells me what to do? Then that way I remember everything and I don't have to keep asking him what to do, and I can get the work done faster. So go ahead and look in your notebooks. Okay, so you did it by holes. Now do you guys know what those holes in the middle of the button are for? Yes, they are for sewing, for putting the thread through to sew the buttons on. Very good. Okay, would anybody else like to share? Okay, great. Well, we're going to end this lesson. I'm going to give you what's called an exit slip question. A couple of exit slip questions, and what those are is that I want you to answer the questions that I'm going to write onto the whiteboard, and I'm going to follow up by repeating them to you, so you can copy them off the whiteboard, and you can also listen to me repeat them, just in case you need more time to write them down. And I'll also keep them displayed up here so everybody can follow along and get the questions done. Okay? Okay. So, question number 1. What is classification? Question number 2. How is classification useful to scientists? And question number 3. Why must scientists compare and contrast when classifying different things? Remember, when you're answering number 3, make sure you think about all the different ways that we classified all the objects that we played with today. Well, sometimes scientists also have to do that in order to understand how a living thing breathes or eats, and things like that. So without being able to classify that species, then we wouldn't be able to understand more about them. So think about that as you're answering number 3. Okay, great. I'll give you about 15 minutes to complete those. And then after that, what we're going to do is I'm going to have my paper collector collect the papers. And I'm going to have my materials collector collect the materials. And then we're going to close for today. And tomorrow's lesson is going to be great as well. Because now that we know what classification means, we're going to talk about different kingdoms of living things and how those are classified. And how they're grouped together in order to get the kingdoms that live amongst us. So if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to raise your hand. and I'll be around to help out wherever needed. Okay? All right, guys, go to work.